this. Fantastic. Okay, so
Without
first
coffee yet. That's pretty good.
I know, and I've already done accounting homework.
Oh my God.
I know. Watch out, watch out. Don't let me sign anything until I finish this. So as part of this series, this is kind of what I consider part 2 of what people are usually not expecting. So like I said, I created this virtual program with the idea that we would take each of these kind of, they almost feel like flashcards sometimes when we're talking about diversity trainings, but I wanted to take one of them at a time and go really deep, right? And so if last time was starting place, which is, you know, language and vocabulary and things like this, I wanted to talk a little bit about where that vocabulary came from. And fun facts, all of this vocabulary should be about you, not collecting other people. So if we enter into part 2 of unconscious bias, again, this is still going to be about you, which works out really well because generally we're pretty narcissistic, if not at least self-absorbed. So we're going to work on ourselves, our perception of ourself, and how the perception of ourself may impact other people. We're building into a conversation that will lead to being a better ally or an advocate across difference and what that means. So with that stated, the term unconscious bias oftentimes already has meaning for people who are receiving this kind of workshop. And so I just want to be mindful that if along the way you have any thoughts or comments, you are welcome to text message 202-670-4262, including if you are listening to the recording, I will still respond to you. But when we start talking about unconscious bias, we have to first really begin to notice our conscious bias so that we can become more conscious of what we are unconscious of. But it is also important that bias can be just as positive as it is negative, right? So this morning, a friend of mine posted on our Facebook group, I found this funny because I knew I was doing a workshop for Duke, but a friend of mine said, if you can't bring yourself to wear a facial mask, remember, people are walking around in Duke t-shirts, right? So that's what I mean by bias. For her, what would be even more an assault on freedom, of course, would be walking around in a Duke t-shirt. And that's because she went to North Carolina. So some of you may remember this from Facebook, but when you saw either the gold and white striped dress or the blue and black striped dress, this was one of the most recent kind of like social experiments that was done. And what I thought was particularly fascinating is that even over social media, what ended up happening is that people picked their team as to what they perceived, and everybody else was completely wrong. Completely wrong. Even though it was a scientific study that occasionally actually changed the photograph that you saw. And then what kind of started happening is some people who are colorblind or weren't able to see like the depth or textures of colors, that started coming out as information. And when people saw the gold and white dress, they did not care if any variation. If you saw the gold and white dress, you were right and everybody else was wrong. If you saw the blue and black dress, you were right and everybody else was wrong. And I just want to remind you that that was actually the experiment. Is would people be able to like adjust to people seeing something different? And occasionally it was something different. So I don't know if y'all remember this or you're still traumatized by this. This is a picture of my brother-in-law. What do you see in this picture? You can unmute yourself or you can actually chat what you see. What story are you writing about my brother-in-law?
Sitting on the edge of a cliff, maybe?
Great. Anybody?
I want to know where's his fishing pole.
I'm sorry?
I want to know where's his fishing pole.
Fishing pole. Okay, good job. Sometimes we can write very complicated stories. Anybody else fill anything else out?
I think he's just hanging out, enjoying, sitting there and enjoying the ocean.
Great.
I'm going to get silly. Similar. He lost his leg to a shark. Oh. And he is there facing his fears.
Ah, great. Okay. Anything else? Great.
Is he sitting on the edge or is he jumping?
I haven't talked to him today, so I'm pretty sure he was sitting at that time. But here's what I think is really fascinating about how bias works. My brother-in-law, Steve, is literally my second favorite part of getting married to my husband. First part being my husband. Steve is wonderful and phenomenal, and I love him to death. He lives on the west coast of Ireland, and we get to see him about maybe once or twice a year. We are supposed to go again this year. Now we're not sure when that's going to happen. And every single time I visit Steve, this happens inevitably the first day, every time I'm there, something will happen and the drape of his pants will catch my attention and I'll go, oh my gosh, Steve is missing a leg. Steve has been missing a leg for a very long time. It was actually a ship accident that involved rope and he saved someone's life and then the rope cut off his leg. But I know this about Steve, and every time I visit Steve, I literally think he has done something wrong. How is he missing an ankle? I don't understand. But what ends up happening every single time, and he's so sarcastic, he calls me out on it because he knows when I'm like, but what's amazing is that I am so convinced I know that he has two legs that I have to remember, no, actually he lost a leg. And then it shows up every time we go on a trip. Like, should he be driving? Yes, Jessica, he's never driven at all since he lost his leg. But now that I have come to visit, he has decided to take our lives in his hands. No, but this is complete ludicrous. But the reason why I like to use this as an example is that I do diversity work for a living and am still not constantly conscious of what I am unconscious of. This is an ongoing work that needs to occur. I know a lot about Steve, and I will think he is wrong instead of I forgot something. Or I will think he is wrong because I have all of the information that I feel entitled to. When we start talking about bias, it's this line that I need us all to pay attention to today of when do you feel that you have all of the information and what happens if you're wrong. And if we can kind of pay attention, we'll be less likely to be defensive when we find out we don't have all the information, or like in my case, I actually do have all the information. I just keep forgetting all of the information and yet still assume that I am right. By the way, I've been married for over 15 years, still a problem. I think that it's an important way to mention this. And then Beverly, you actually posted something too that I think is always a great follow-up, is that I use this picture with permission. And what is fascinating when I ask people, what do you see in this story? No one ever mentions that Steve is obviously white. And no one ever mentions that Steve seems to have lost a leg until enough comments have come in and I keep asking for more details. And then kind of like, I think it's Leila did, that it becomes like a heroic thing, or like dun 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 dun, facing your fears. Like that is like, but there's trauma and tragedy and resilience connected to that part of the story once it gets mentioned. So we even have a bias about the story that I just threw up a picture and said, tell me a story here, right? That's a very important thing to kind of understand too, of what you're allowed to talk about, what you're not allowed to talk about. I am a good Southerner. There is front porch topics and there are back porch topics, but we do that even without a porch. So that's what I'm talking about with bias. Now, I grew up Jessica, and Jessica Simpson played a very important role in my life as far as like how I was kind of supposed to be as a young adult. I'm older than her significantly, but people think I'm younger. And I just want to use this as an example of when we talk about worldview and the impact of our bias and how these things kind of come together. So some of you may possibly recall The Dukes of Hazzard as a movie, and Jessica Simpson was cast as Daisy Duke. For the record, if you have not seen this movie, I would not make note of it. It is okay to miss it. But when Jessica Simpson was preparing for this role of Daisy Duke, she worked out like 9 hours a day. She ate less than 1,000 calories a day so that she could get as small as possible for the Daisy Duke role. Now, as someone who has struggled with my weight and eating and my emotions and eating my emotions my whole life, anytime anyone named Jessica ever has anything to do with weight, someone in my family feels the need to keep me updated on people's weight change. So I knew everything about Jessica Simpson's workout habits and eating habits and things like this, I guess, as a subtle hint to me. This was the same thing in the 80s when Jessica McClure got stuck on a pipe. Everyone asked me if I had heard anything about her. No, she's actually in Odessa. But the reason why I bring this up is that Jessica Simpson was given accolades for doing everything that she could to be the part of Daisy Duke. Now, the truth is that she's actually quite a small person to begin with. So it's not like Roseanne Barr was cast as Daisy Duke, who then had to go through this physical transformation to appear to be Daisy Duke. The picture on the right is her shortly after the movie debuted at her concert. But this is how the United States, specifically culture, works around women's health, weight, shape, etc. Is that the picture on the right is her at her concert, but that's not what showed up in the media. This is the picture that was on the right that showed up in the media, and you'll notice that it's been a little bit altered, or possibly maybe it's just a different angle, but she certainly doesn't look as thin as she could be in real life, and she's actually quite a petite person. So to go one more step further, this is a cartoon that appeared shortly after the image of her at her concert. She was evidently dating someone named Tony Roma, which is like a football player or something. I don't do sports ball. And in the cartoon, she's breaking up with Tony Roma because she met Ronald McDonald. And notice how large she is in the doorway of the cartoon compared to the photoshopped or possibly very bad angle picture of what is reality, which is where she's like a size 0 to begin with. Now, the reason why this is important is that this is where our bias impacts and intersects with our worldview. The fact that they were judging Jessica Simpson's weight gain after what most medical practitioners would say is an incredibly unhealthy way of living to prepare for the movie role to begin with, when she was done with the movie and was healthy as a size 0 probably again, this is how she was rewarded publicly. Now, I use this because most of us don't necessarily think of Jessica Simpson as like a target of hate and as an upper class, heteronormatively gorgeous blonde woman. We don't necessarily think about her being targeted. But if she has all of these dominant identities or all of these privileged identities and can still have this story written about her, imagine what happens when people have visible, subordinated, or marginalized identities. When we start talking about those story writing skills, it is not about never writing a story. It's about remembering you do, and we all do. And what informs the stories that we write is our individual worldview, as well as the worldview of the culture we're kind of swimming in. So my premise is I can't necessarily take responsibility for the whole world's culture, or at least my realm of influence is culture, but I can take responsibility for my own patterns. So that's why I wanted to use it as an example. When we talk about this kind of culture piece or this unconscious piece, I like this image of tire tracks in the desert or in the sand dunes, because the culture is actually the wind. Your individual responsibility are the tire tracks, and the wind will cover it up and you will lose your way and you will have to keep moving. This unconsciousness is what is kind of already set in place. So if you can become more conscious of what you are unconscious of, then you are actually doing the work of working against the bias that you don't even necessarily know that you have. One of my friends, Joe Gerstand, this is one of my favorite quotes of his, is that you're not responsible for your first thought, but you are responsible for your second thought. And your first action is usually informed by that second thought. That's where the power lies. So if the unconscious stuff is this autopilot stuff related to our culture, okay, but then what do we do with it? And it's that second thought in the middle where we can actually adjust accordingly to be more conscious. And this works both positive and negative bias. Can we become more responsible for our second thought and inform our actions from our second thought? I believe we can. So this is a very famous optical illusion. And just out of curiosity, do you see a duck or do you see a bunny, or can you flip back and forth? Feel free to put it in the chat or unmute. Do you see a duck?
Both.
Do you see a bunny, or do you see both?
Both.
Yeah, I
Excellent.
see both, and I think because I've seen it so many times, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Great. So there's a lot of boths. Good job. I don't see the beer. Where's the beer, Megan? That's exciting. Oh, duck, rabbit, brewing. Got it. Got it. Okay, great. So here's what's really interesting. I use this one on purpose because most people are really familiar with it. But much like the gold or the blue dress earlier, there is kind of a loyalty that happens to which one you see first. So if you saw the duck first, you're like, I saw the duck. I'm capable of seeing the rabbit, but I see the duck first. Some people have a lot of pride that they are team both, that they can go bloop, 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 and see both. And there are other people who will be absolutely convinced that people who see a duck are insane because obviously it's a bunny and they have no idea what's going on. So if we can notice this, and this is what we need to delete, not whether or not it is a duck or a bunny, but that we have this loyalty to what we perceive and everyone else is wrong. That artist wants you to see both. That's why they drew what they drew. They want you to see both. So when you think you're right because you see one, or you think you're superior because you see both, that's where negative bias can really be negatively impacting other people, is because other people are accurate too. And that was actually the artist's intent. Because perhaps it's because I always saw ducks in my neighborhood growing up. Great. Okay, cool. I didn't know anything about the brewery either. So if this kind of flip, click, 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 click thing is something that you can kind of practice on, then what ends up happening is that if you get good with this skill, I feel like Beyonce, if you get good with this skill, then what ends up happening is that when you're in a scenario and you start getting defensive, which we all do, like, what? What's going on? What's happening? I thought I knew what was happening here. You can slow down and have that second thought about, wait, what else could be happening here? And then you can write all kinds of stories about what else could be happening here. And it opens up the possibility for other things than what you perceive, right? So like, no, Steve did not lose his leg to a shark. But now that we've talked about losing his leg to a shark, we can have a conversation about the boat accident that he was in. But if we can't at least have the conversation, then we just pretend we don't notice. Or in my case, I forget all the time that he only has one leg from the knee down. And every time I visit him, it throws me for a loop. So then when I see his pants doing something that I'm confused about, I literally, my first thought is Steve doesn't seem to know he's missing a leg. I'm pretty sure he's quite aware, right? But what the truth is that I forgot. That's the flip of the bias. So some of you may remember some of the media that came out around Katrina. I tried to use Katrina on purpose because it's long enough ago that we don't have to do right now. But COVID is a great example. Any major disaster is a great example, right? But how things are reported are very biased. This shouldn't be shocking for most people. But these are real news articles. One of them is, I would perceive a young Black kid who, of course, was looting a grocery store. And then in the bottom picture, it's interesting to me that I perceive the white people on the bottom as adults. I don't know, they could be kids too. I've never been good at that age game. But in the middle of a flood, they found bread and soda. Isn't that just phenomenal? Can you imagine the luck of just finding bread and soda? The reason why this is important is that in a disaster, I don't think anybody's finding anything, but I also think in the middle of a disaster, no one is looting anything, or at least not with intention of like, hey, I'm going to steal me some shit. I don't think that's happening. I think this is survival mechanism, but who's allowed to survive and who isn't allowed to survive, and how is that reported with respect, is directly impacted by bias, not just bias on an individual level, but by the media, by how we cover events, how we talk about events, and how we move forward with the information that we believe is true based on our bias. So I wrote a book called Notice Notes that has a bunch of different conversation starters. And one of them in particular that I use around bias is grocery stores tend to be one of my favorite things. And I didn't realize until I was well into my 30s, actually, that the ethnic food aisle in the grocery store that I shop in and buy stuff. But if that's the ethnic food aisle, I'm using air quotes, then what is the rest of the food in the grocery store? And what was particularly interesting is that as I travel different grocery stores, what is on different ethnic food aisles is very, very different, but depending on where the grocery store is at. And what I just think it's interesting that like spices are in one section of the rest of the grocery store, but spices specifically to the ethnic food aisle will be in a specific part there. The same aisle could have hair products, but not be with the other hair products. When we divide things out like that, all we're doing is keeping that kind of us and the thems, but we can customize grocery store aisles based on what people need. One of the reasons I love grocery styles so much is the end caps usually have the condiments or something that go with what is on the rest of the aisle. And let's take hot dogs, for example. Depending on where you are in the country, what people are generally putting on a hot dog varies wildly. I'd never even thought about some of that stuff on a hot dog. Or how you eat watermelon or something like this can very much change regionally, and the things that go along with it are there. So then I learn new ways of eating things. For the record, watermelon, lime, and feta cheese is amazing. Would never have thought of that combination. It doesn't matter. So kind of going back to the news sources or the grocery store, it doesn't actually matter if they're from different sources or what's happening. What happens is the bias specifically related to race and socioeconomic class that happens. That is why those newspaper articles are reported differently, even though they're actually sourced from the same material. So in that particular case, just to disagree with one of the comments that came in, is that those particular articles were written from the exact same source material. They were just typed in different ways. Same thing with grocery stores is Kroger's, for example, could have all the same inventory, but where that inventory is on the aisles of the grocery store will wildly change based on where that Kroger is at. And sometimes we consider that convenience, right? Like, we like to put things together to make things easy, or we could take a capitalistic approach, right? Like that we're trying to increase sales and we want to upsell all the different condiments that go along with each thing. And that's what most people want in this area. That's fine. And it is still a bias. Bias doesn't have to be negative in order to be biased, but we tend to focus on negative bias, right? And then we attribute the negative bias to race or class or sexuality or something. Positive bias is also related to race, sex, gender, socioeconomic class, etc. But it's the bias in general that you can take the same thing and shift what it means in a very, very different way. So that's a pretty common thing. You do hear dogs barking in the background. I have 3 of them and the mail is coming. So you'll get used to it as we meet at 9 o'clock. Sorry. I'm very well protected from the mailman, and our neighbors have visitors. I don't know why we have visitors. Aren't we supposed to be sheltering in place? But that's called judgment or bias. Look, on topic. But they tend to stand out front of the house that they are visiting with a dog on a leash while smoking a cigarette, which is to great consternation to my dogs. So you will probably hear them. Great, what else? Walmart says it will no longer lock up African-American beauty products. Well, that's good to know. I've never had to buy shampoo from a locked case before. That's a great example of bias. In this case, kind of negative, but also potentially positive, right? Like the positive bias that someone uses whatever shampoo I'm choosing, which is ever cheap at the time, they don't necessarily think I'm going to steal it. The negative bias is that people who would use black hair products are more likely to steal it, so we have to lock it up. Do you see the difference there? That's bias. Even it could be same grocery store. So we'll keep going along. When I've mentioned this before, and I always just think it's really, really important, is that when we start talking about responsibility, there is a loop conversation that we can get into where somebody else is always responsible for this. And I used to teach that all the time too in diversity trainings. And eventually I realized nothing seemed to possibly be changing. And so me kind of curing myself from my own burnout was, instead of focusing out there, I want to focus in here. And what if I could actually be responsible for that second thought part of me? How would that impact my actions and behaviors? So if I can be responsible for me, even if it's just some of the time, I think I'm going to have more genuine, authentic relationships with other people. Now, in my research, I came up with this model, and I'm going to talk about it relatively briefly, just to kind of understand where our bias comes from. But it's head, heart, and action are the different variables. So y'all are all at work, so we'll use work as an example. You do not have to share this information out loud. But I just want you to think about your delightful coworker team that I know you love and you get along with everyone. But chances are there is somebody on this team, on this webinar right now, that annoys you. Maybe they frustrate you occasionally. Okay, great. You don't have to name names. I would not recommend that. But what I need you to do is I need you to think about the people that you work with that absolutely frustrate you at least once in a while. Okay, again, no names. So whoever it is that frustrates you, my theory is the reason why they frustrate you is because your particular bias of the way you show up at work, or the way you accomplish a task, or the way you get things done, or the way you run a meeting, the way you think that that should happen, probably is related to your bias. And the reason why you're frustrated by them is because they have done somewhat different manner. When I started trying to rescue myself from my own burnout, what I realized is that there was a pattern of way people were actually telling me that they couldn't engage in a conversation across difference. There was a reason that they couldn't have the conversations, even though they felt that they needed to, but they weren't prepared, or they didn't think they were going to go well, or they've already tried once and it didn't work and they're just done. And this frustration piece, I began to notice, is directly linked to kind of a bias story of what people think they think about themselves and what people think about what they think about other people. So when I started paying attention to these kind of excuses, for lack of better words, or patterns, what I began to notice is that you fit into 3 different categories. Now, all 3 of these variables are in all of us. So this isn't like a horoscope sign or something like that. You have all 3 of them. And your life has taught you and me to generally show up with 2 of them. And if we show up with 2 of them, we feel pretty safe and we feel pretty prepared, right? So what is interesting is that you can't actually know if you have conscious or unconscious bias without actually involving other people. So Karen, when you posted, I have to be honest, I don't believe in unconscious bias. What I think is important to know is that unconscious in this way is the stuff you don't know that you have until it comes up. And if it never comes up, you don't know that it was there. But there's I'm not a psychologist, but there's no way for you to be 100% conscious of every single thing that is going on. And often your repeated behaviors, you're not even conscious of. There's psychological tests of, do you put your left sock on first or your right sock on, or why? Or you can think of that story where people chop the ends of their ham off and they never knew why. And the reason why is their grandmother had too small of a pan. This is how cultural habits get passed down, and we don't necessarily know the reasons of what they are, and we can repeat them without even consciously knowing that we're repeating them. A really great example, and I get asked a lot about can you be absolved from unconscious bias? But one of the things that I think is really interesting is, again, grocery stores. I actually braved the world and went out into the grocery store this week, and as I was going to the grocery store, somebody was going the wrong way in the open kind of meat section of the grocery store. Now, there are not arrows on the ground, even though there's social distancing in theory, but I have a map of my grocery store. When I enter the door, I go through the grocery store in the exact same way. I generally go to the same cashier in the same way. That way I don't forget anything. I know what's going on. If I have a list, I've even organized my list in how I go through the grocery store. But let's be honest, I don't make a list for the grocery store. I just buy what I normally buy. When I thought this person was going the wrong way down the grocery store aisles, I bumped into them a number of times, and I got more and more frustrated at them because they were not following my traffic patterns. I don't even know that I really knew I had ownership of a grocery store traffic pattern, but I certainly did, and they were screwing it up. The people that seemed to actually kind of follow along, I didn't know that I judged them as absolutely correct. They are navigating the grocery store in the correct way. But I don't necessarily notice the positive bias of it, but when someone started going the wrong direction, now I don't mean in the same aisle, I just mean you shouldn't be here yet. You should go over in that corner first. Like I was judging how they were grocery shopping. That was unconscious of me until I have this practice skill of being like, why am I getting so fired up? It is a grocery store. There are no arrows. I'm not in charge. I am not the manager. They are 6 feet away. They're following other complicated rules. Like, you let it go. It's going to be okay. But that's when I realized that I now have some kind of like consciousness to the way that I navigate my grocery store. I've been going to the grocery store for over 15 years. Didn't notice it. That's kind of what I mean. So when we start talking about head, heart, and action, our life has taught us how to show up. Whatever it is you have survived are the best tools that you have going on how to actually engage across difference or with your bias, and to use your bias as a tool for good instead of actually like a disconnect or a disingenuous connection with someone else. So if we can understand them, we can understand more about ourselves, but sometimes that's too like staring into the sun. So back to what the people at work that you're annoyed by. Now, when I say heady, I don't mean necessarily intellectual or smart, but I mean very detail oriented. If it was a lamp, it would be a downward facing lamp that like makes one little circle on exactly what you're reading at that moment, right? That person. Hardy does not mean emotions. According to my therapist, emotions are appropriate in given situations. I'm working on that. But what I mean by heart is like an attachment to a larger idea, bigger concepts. So something small can happen and poof, happens, and you're like, where did you go? What is going on? Sometimes those people are like executive directors of nonprofits, for example. They like are there for the mission and the cause, but like, what's the budget? I don't know. And then action-oriented people, this is actually how we end up burning out most of our volunteers. If people who have a high action level is that they've done like an inventory of their time, they've decided they want to volunteer, then the first thing they have to do is sit through a meeting to talk about how they might be able to volunteer, but there's no doing happening. So then if we send them to too many meetings talking about what they could be doing, they will eventually stop coming because high action-oriented people like the doings. So if those are kind of the three main variables, and again, all of them are in all of us. To use as an example, I'll use like public art. Maybe you're thinking of graffiti. This is actually outside of Dolores Park in San Francisco. So I am a head action person. So what happens when I see public art, the first thing I think of, the heady part, is I spell check it first. And then I check and see if what's the property damage, or would it increase the property value? Did they have a permit? Those kind of questions immediately happen. Because I'm also action oriented, I also very much want to know how this occurred. Like, did they have a ladder? Did they use drones? Was it a group of people? Like, how did the art occur? Did they map it out in advance? Were they inspired in the exact moment? Now, people who I know who might be more hardy, when they see something like this, they may think about beautifying the neighborhood, right? Or they might think, there's a piece of art here in town where the mural that had been there forever just got repainted. And so there are people who are devastated and grieving the old mural that's not even there anymore, even though the new mural is quite pretty and it's done by the exact same artist. But it doesn't matter. They're grieving the past. So that's kind of the heart part, right? So depending on where you're showing up, all three of those responses are on topic. But if all three of them are happening at the same time with three different people, then it looks like you're miscommunicating. And you'll get frustrated because you're talking close to the same thing, except your response to it is very, very different. This is where your bias comes in, whether you're conscious or unconscious of it, and your habits, so you will keep repeating them. I will forever be the annoying person in the meeting that's like, excuse me, how much did we pay for this pen? Excuse me, what color shirt were they wearing when they made that announcement? Like, I don't know why I get so tripped up on details, but I totally get tripped up on details, and you have to feed them to me, or I will continue asking these very detailed things, which drives everyone nuts. If Hetty's this downward facing lamp, Hardy is an upward facing lamp, and action is kind of like a strobe light, right? Not necessarily the best reading tool, but super fun. So if a heady person is looking at the details, the hardy person wants to know the artist, right? Like who and how, and talk about the community impacts, and why'd you pick a giant rooster, and are those flowers indigenous? And I love them. Probably a heady response of asking if they're indigenous to the area. Action-oriented people want to know the actual steps involved or actually be doing those kind of things. When you ask questions, depending on what kind of questions you're asking, you will be immediately aligned. So like Beverly, let's take, if you asked a really specific question, I would be like, thank you, Beverly. I have been trying to find out if this is Article 6 or Article 4 in the bylaws. Can we please focus on what's important here? So then if Beverly were to ask a question, even if it's not related to my obsession about bylaws, then it slows the conversation down and we can get back to details. So then I might align with someone who's asking more questions. If people are dreamers, which usually are in immediate conflict with the questioners, the dreamers are connecting to things. What if we did this? What if we did this? I see this artwork. What if we order some kind of movie screen and we invite people to a public movie screening? Wouldn't that be amazing and incredible? The action-oriented people are like lucky to be in the same room, if they haven't already just left and Googled outdoor movie screens, right? Because that also can happen. Action people tend to be the pickup truck ladder kind of people. Whereas a heady person, if you asked me to buy the best priced outdoor movie screen, best price, do we mean locally sourced? Do we mean on sale currently? Do I have a budget? What budget line is this coming out of? What credit card am I supposed to use? Am I supposed to use a purchase order, or should I buy cash? Like, I can be stupefied away from action because of the details. Now, the reason why these are important is that if we all show up in a head, heart, action way, whether we know it or not, conscious or not, we can choose to become more conscious of how we actually show up. When you think about frustrations or conversations that's gone wrong or relationships that have gone wrong, spoiler alert, you're the common denominator. So, where of course they are terribly wrong, you were actually there for all of those things. So at some point in time, when do you take responsibility for what you are doing in the things that are going wrong? You're probably not just a magnet of frustrating people. There is probably something that you and I are doing that are frustrating people in very similar ways. So we can become more conscious of those habits or more conscious of those responses. And that is a really good practice, self-tool about your own kind of being and your own way of responding to things. And once you get some good muscle memory there, then you can actually start looking at what you are conscious or unconsciously impacted by, and what you are doing that is impacting other people. So I bring this kind of model to you briefly, and we'll talk about it possibly more in depth at later ones, but I want to remind you, you are all three. And I want to remind you that your lived experience has taught you the two usually that you show up with the most. So if I were, again, let's think about your annoying coworkers. Maybe they're not on the call. They're totally on the call. But whoever it is that you are frustrated by, what I want you to do is just imagine what it is that makes them frustrating. And we're going to do a thing where I want you to pay attention to what it is that makes you frustrating. Because even though you are angelically perfect, you're probably bringing some degree of frustration to the frustrating situations as well, right? So for head action folks, those are like me, what tends to make us really annoying is that we do not play well with others. Generally, we are the ones that say, like, if you would just let me take this project by myself and just let me do it on my own. I'll get it done faster. It'll be done fine. And I won't have to collaborate with anybody else. I don't like group work. If I do have to do group work, like let's say that somebody decides that me and Russell have to work together, great. So then the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give Russell a to-do list. I've already taken everything off of the to-do list that I actually want to do. So now we're just delegating the things that are extra. I'm going to lie about the deadline because I don't actually trust Russell to do it right. So then I'm going to have to fix it, right? That is what makes head action oriented people annoying, generally annoying. So what is important about the head action people is that we will eventually stumble into our heart part, the third dangling piece. It's not non-existent. It actually fuels all of our excuses until we stumble into it and can use it for good. So if the head action people are these detail-oriented, get it done, solo, lone wolf kind of people, when we begin to realize that our work matters or that it's impacting somebody on a greater scale, then we can actually show up in our trifecta. Head and action are automatic, heart shows up. When we are unstoppable, then we will do an amazing amount of work that we wouldn't even know that we could do. But often we have to be reminded why we matter, why our contribution really matters. So if you supervise someone like this, that's where you should start, is you should start kind of squelching down their imposter syndrome or their fraud feelings and explain to them why they matter and why they're individually, why they are such an important part of the team. Then they will feel a little bit better and show up with all three variables. Heart action folks, you are my dreamer people. And what's interesting about you is that you don't get really bogged down by details like budgets and staffing and hours or gravity. You have lots of ideas. Often you have ideas that interrupt the implementation of the last idea. So you can get very frustrated for other people because they are still implementing idea 47 and you have now moved on to idea 52. Could you slow down so we can actually finish something? So the heart action people, they're also dependent on people scurrying around them because they don't actually even really know what they're about to say. And they're very aware that they don't know all the details. So they're usually very appreciative of other people, but it's because they don't know what they're doing without those other people. Then eventually they will tap into a system. And once they tap into a system, that system will help their dreams and actions like make sense. They will show up in their trifecta and they will be unstoppable. So if you're frustrated by one of these people or you're supervising one of these people, that's one of the best places to start, is to provide some structure for them and use that structure as a way of having a conversation. I always think of one-on-ones as a great example of this. As a strong head action person, I don't need your agenda because one, it's got a typo on it, and two, you forgot two things I talked about last week, and now I'm annoyed at your agenda. Whereas a heart action person might really appreciate it because you've helped prioritize the order of what to talk about. That might stimulate them to have an idea of something else to add to the agenda, so it would be a helpful tool. Do you see how the same thing could have very different responses based on a person's bias? Last but not least is the head heart people. I always do you last because generally you're the ones listening to this like, I don't really know what she's talking about. I don't know if she's talking about at work or at home. How am I supposed to choose which variables I am? This is a very big commitment. I don't just make decisions really quickly. For the record, this is literally how I sell books because the head heart people have to read the whole book before they'll even diagnose themselves. And because of karma, I married one of you. So head heart people, very low action, right? So they're the ones that get stuck in spin cycle. This is the person you would never ask at the beginning of lunch hour, where do you want to go to lunch? Because you're going to spend half a lunch talking about which taco truck, right? Or they'll open a drawer and they share all the menus of every single possibility of where you could possibly eat lunch. And they remember all of the details of what happened the last time you went there. Meanwhile, you're like, it's Taco Tuesday. Can we move along, please, Barbara? So head heart people can get stuck. They also are the mavens of information. So when your copy machine breaks after midnight on a federal holiday, they're the ones who are like, I know a guy. right? So they know all this stuff, they can rescue you, and when they can show up in action, they also can show up in their trifecta, right? Sometimes they just need to know what to do, and otherwise their default do is gather and think and reflect instead of like do. I joke all the time that if we have a house fire, my husband is going to die in the house fire picking the most efficient way out of the house. That's just what's going to happen, right? That can be very frustrating. And of course, I love him and I have learned how to accommodate it. And I also know if we have a house fire, I'm going to have to throw him over my shoulder and go, and then we can critique the exit strategy next time. So if that's generally how the three variables work, then what I think is fascinating about my work and why I love my work so much is that this also aligns with my social justice heroes. So when I was doing my master's level work, I did a lot of archival research on letters and journals and things like this. And this gas pedal piece is what happens when you connect into your third variable, because it can slow you down with excuses and it can also motivate you there. And yes, you have all three of them for sure, Beverly. And I would also say, hopefully my next research study is that the more emotionally intelligent you are, the more you can tap into all three based on what is needed in the moment. If we were to take Martin Luther King is a great example of a heart action person, literally had a dream, not a plan. Also had a PhD and was an ordained minister before the age of 40. Tapping into the system made it really important for him to be able to like do the work he was doing. Martin Luther King's work also became significantly more impactful when it shifted from straight Black Christian men and straight white Christian men being equal to actually being about a living wage. And when he took on the system of labor and what it means to be paid for labor and a living wage, that is when his work actually became more threatening to systems of oppression that were in place, because he could show up in his trifecta. Mother Teresa is a great example of the head heart folks, literally caught in spin cycle. She didn't know if it was God's will to have this much suffering on the planet, or if it was God's will for her to intervene. And because she didn't know, she often made very inconsistent decisions about pain relief or serving other people. She did eventually realize that she could actually build a school, and then was able to show up in her trifecta. And last but not least, Gandhi is a great example of a head action person who was quite annoying to work with, honestly. And also a fun fact about him is that he was assassinated by his own people, not an enemy. Somebody from his own group was like, I am done with you, right? Like that's how annoying us head action people can be. And Gandhi eventually stumbled into the concept of compassion. And that's when he realized his own kind of like ego-driven work actually could impact people larger than him. And that's when he was able to show up in his trifecta. I bring you those folks because if all three of these people were very annoying to work with in a number of ways, and I'm saying this in a summary way, but after reading their own letters and their journals and all kinds of archival research, because I'm that person, it is true they were even aware that they were very annoying to work with. But it is also true that they did good work. So in the people that you are frustrated by, is it possible that they could still do good work if you could be responsible for your bias and how you interact with them? Now, role modeling, being responsible for your own bias and how you interact with them, would actually allow them the space to also become responsible for how they show up. But we can't necessarily make somebody do anything. I don't know if you've thought about this, and I don't have children. Parents always tell me that you can make your kids do something, and I'm like, really? Like, think about it. They'll find a loophole and a rule. But if we can't control other people, we can only control ourselves. I find that if we start with like frustration or annoying, then it's kind of an easier entry place into this conversation about how we show up in a room. It's a lot easier. It's even sometimes kind of funny that when we are able to like, oh yeah, that's what I do that's frustrating, that's like the first step of self-awareness. And for some people, it's the very, very first step of self-awareness. So then once you do that, then you can begin to understand what your patterns are, what your habits are, what you're conscious of, what you're unconscious of. And then once you're able to have and garner that self-reflection, then we can have a conversation about how you normally show up and how that impacts other people. How your positive or negative bias, conscious or unconscious, impacts other people, how microaggressions or micro inequities impact other people, how collusion and participation impact other people. But we can't do that without actually the firm foundation of how you show up and how that compares to the other people that you're working with, so that you can begin to identify the patterns of the positive and the negative relationships that you currently have now. Then you can be responsible for people that you may never see again, that you just kind of like casually talk to on the phone. Think about like a wrong number, right? Somebody texts you from a wrong number. There's an opportunity for a connection there, and it may never last beyond you have the wrong number. But how do you respond to that, and how do you not respond to that? Again, all three variables are in you and in all of us, which is also kind of giving some grace to other people. But when you can do that, the cycle of change can begin, because you're actually starting on a firm foundation where you know where you're at. When people want change to happen, the idea or the evolution of that change, sometimes those arguments are still long and true, decades, if not hundreds of years later. It is still very true that we are fighting for change. And there are other things that will be much more short-lived or much more cyclical. But you can't engage in the cycle of change until you actually understand who you are and why you are and how you are with other people. This is an image that showed up again on Facebook for a really long, kind of a long time ago, I guess. And it seemed that everybody I knew was printing it out and putting it out on their walls and things like this. So just an example of a heady person. It had a typo in it. But what is beautiful, I think, about the image is that if oppression connects all of us, what we often end up doing is waiting for the rest of all of us to come on board. And what I'm suggesting is that from our dominant privileged identities, can we do our own self-reflection and take work from our dominant places to do work for the subordinated and marginalized folks that exist across this difference, because it's at lower risk to us. If we start doing work from our dominant places and we're aware of who and how we are, the lower risk of me doing anti-racism work is significantly lower than a heterosexual person doing work around transphobia or biphobia or homophobia, or a Christian doing work around a non-Protestant or Catholic faith. Being able to do those works from our dominant places, the risk is lower. So right now, when the conversation is quite up, specifically about racism and Black Lives Matter, it's really fascinating to me how many white people I know right now who are like, I'm so exhausted from this topic. And I'm like, how's being alive working? Because there's a very big difference between exhaustion and discomfort and safety and just kind of checking out. And the way that privilege works from our dominant places is that we're doing this work, and because it's so low risk, it might actually feel kind of like a hobby. Whereas people who are doing work from their subordinated and marginalized places, literally trying to be held in an equitable space so that they can live, it's really hard to hear people wanting to join a book club, right? So my learning curve from my dominant identities is occurring at the exact same time while someone else is experiencing pain. And if I'm unconscious that I even need a learning curve, then I'm unconscious while someone else is in pain. So if we kind of unravel that back, then knowing who and how we are, where our dominant identities and privileged identities are, where our subordinated and marginalized identities are, which most of us are much more familiar with because we have to stay here to like live, to survive, to thrive, then we would be able to kind of move forward in a way at much lower risk to be allies and advocates for other people. But it starts at becoming conscious of what we are unconscious of. So I know we are at almost the top of the hour. Thank you for letting me kind of do that a little bit longer. I tried to stay up with the chats, but there was lots of stuff going on. So I want to check and see if there's any questions out loud while I scan through the chats and see if there's anything I need to answer before we're done for the day. Any thoughts or comments on this particular kind of step in our journey together?
So, Jess, I think that although I kind of understand the head heart action, I'm not sure how it all relates to bias and how we were talking about it. And I think there was a bit of kind of, I don't know if it was confusion for me or what it was. I know that this is a self-reflection and you have to start yourself first, but it almost seems to be a siloed thing in going out, because we can do the head heart action within us, but we can't do it for anybody else. We can't like, like you mentioned King and you mentioned Mother Teresa and those people. You know that only because you've gone back and you've seen that. So now you can go back and reflect on how they acted or how
Yes.
they respond, because you know that. We don't know that when we're really dealing with people. Usually at work, maybe we can get to know people, but when we're out here with people we don't know, we have no time to come up with a pattern. We might do that here, and it might be good to do that here because we work together. That's great. But when we go out, we're not doing that. So it's sort of like, how do we then move that out of that silo, or even out of this silo of work beyond? That's what I'm not sure that
Sure.
I
So
can.
the like quickest link I would say is the privilege of having an actual relationship with someone versus other people, right? Other people are going to show up whether we know it or not, whether we're conscious or unconscious. Well, if we're not conscious of it, we would be unconscious of it. That's how grammar works. But the people that you don't have relationships with, they show up on a group level. And when people you do have relationships with tend to show up on an individual level. And what ends up happening is from our privileged places, we, like, as a very privileged person, I generally feel entitled to show up as Jess Pettit, right? Like, I am one person. So that's part of the reason why this Karen thing, calling white women Karen, has been so upsetting to so many white women, which is really just proving the whole Karen thing, is that that we don't necessarily realize what groups we are connected to, and the habits we are responsible for are related to that group, not an individual. And people are like, I've never done that before. This is when people say, like, I dated a black guy, or I've never owned slaves, therefore I cannot be racist. Okay, we're not talking about individual behavior. We're talking about white behavior, and you're a white person, and you're responsible for that. So as frustrating as it is for me as a white woman, if you don't have an individual relationship with me, people, in order to feel safe and prepared, when they see me coming, are going to treat me, whatever story they have about white women, first. I might get the privilege of becoming an individual human being, but that's not the case, right? So there's a case right now going around Facebook that there's a black man walking down the street to go to Walgreens, and he's like thrown, he's still alive for the record, but he's thrown to the ground, handcuffed, they broke his wrist, and then another police officer shows up and is like, what are you doing? That's not the guy. Oh, what do you mean? Did you check his ID? Yes. They asked for his driver's license, has a completely different name on it because it is not the right person, but because it is a black man and these two other police officers are out supposed to be looking for this particular black man, this man, who just an innocent bystander, is treated this way because of group membership. Not because of individual membership, because if that's the case, the name on the driver's license obviously is not the name on the warrant of the person that they were looking for. So being the connection between how we group membership and individual membership and conscious and unconsciousness, and the head heart action piece, which is a lot of things. I get it. It's very early in my morning and I haven't even had coffee yet. It's a lot to be like, wait a minute, what is going on? So if we can become more conscious of what we are unconscious of, that's kind of layer one, right? Part of what we are unconscious of is how we show up as a group, especially from our dominant identities. Most of us are like, what are you talking about? So another great example is white straight men. Sometimes that's the first time they've ever been called a group. And they're like, I'm not a white straight man. I'm Kevin. What are you talking about? So then you need to stop and think about your group memberships, all of them. Can you become more conscious to the point that you're even willing to take some responsibility of the past, current, and future behaviors of those groups? So what ends up happening is heady response is no, because I wasn't even alive in 1852. I don't even know, like, why was Frederick Douglass questioning July 4th as Independence Day then? I learned that in history class. Then we'll go down to this very specific transcript-based thing. That's a heady response to when you're being defensive. A hearty response is, how the hell am I supposed to be responsible for people I've never even met? I don't know, compassion. That's really the answer, right? The idea of compassion, that your actions impact people who are long after you. This is part of the reason Greta was so powerful for people, but challenged on an individual level, right? Is when Greta was like, hi, you, pointing to me, right, have destroyed the planet that I'm supposed to live on, and I am claiming responsibility for this. Get your act together, right? Like, to be challenged by a child who's connected to the future of what we have actually done to the planet very much disrupted people. So then that brought out a bunch of action responses of like, what do you want? Okay, fine. I won't use a plastic straw anymore. Right? So then and then other people are like, really? We're in a plastic cup with a plastic lid, but now we have a paper straw. How about we stop consuming things? Right? So then we started judging the little actions that people were doing. The defensiveness is the connection, unfortunately, and the defensiveness is usually a habit that we're also usually unconscious of. So what are our habits? Our life has taught us these habits. I'm not judging them as good or bad, because those judgments and assumptions that we all make us feel safe and prepared. That doesn't make us accurate, nor does it make us conscious of those habits in the first place. But if we can do our own work in our free time, won't it be a lot easier to understand our group membership and how we show up as an individual to other people? That's kind of the premise connection. And I get it's a lot of jumps for a Friday morning. So, other thoughts or comments? I'm trying to scan the chats at the same time.
Jess, I'll just ask a quick question since we're at the top of the hour, and I know a lot of folks are probably thinking there's a lot to talk about, but yet the session's over. Maybe our last session, will there be time maybe to table some discussions or leave some openings to talk about things that have come up? Because I like that we're packing in a lot of stuff to see and talk about, but I'm just wondering if that is part of the next two sessions.
In theory, yes. And the text messages that I receive in between the days that we meet also very much help me figure out what examples to use, what to use for the next session. So the idea of having this long series of time is that I'm on your schedule. We just occasionally meet face to face. And then the content of the different webinars begin to open up a little bit more. I just needed to get the foundational pieces in, so hopefully that is the case.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Absolutely.
And I was wondering.
Yes.
I was wondering, that document that Brandy attached to the email about our organization and diversity. Yes. Are we going to do anything with that, or was that just for our own self-reflection? Or
you and I are not doing anything with that unless you would like to, but it is to stimulate conversation within y'all's group. Sometimes having an outsider help you with that process is helpful, because then it's not like Victor's agenda of now we're going to go through this whole workshop or this whole worksheet, but it's also similar to, it's easier to talk about your own individual stuff and how you'd respond to public art. That is the beginning place of a conversation of how you're responding to difference in the world, right? Whether it's Black Lives Matter or protests that are happening or health disparities that are killing populations of color significantly higher than white people. Starting at that conversation sometimes loses people because it's just so not a practiced habit conversation. So the assessment of your organization, perhaps it's easier for you to assess where you work, but I also encourage you, take that worksheet home. Look at your house, right? Look at your cell phone. You can answer those questions, just change the context as well. And then that gives you a little bit more of an assessment of how diverse actually is your life. You know, I would like to think that I'm a very diverse person, but when I really think about my close friends, I'm not that diverse. Everybody that's on speed dial has almost the exact same politics as me. We might have different pizza topping choices, but like I have my comfort zone. They're called a comfort zone because they don't challenge me. So then what am I doing to nurture the ones that are kind of on the tertiary there of like, no, 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 I really need to connect with you. And then I'll intentionally be trying to develop those relationships instead of people that are on, you know, the exact same season, same episode of life as me. One of the comments that came in is when it comes to how people interact with people of color, I'm just not sure. Or are we talking about this in another context? All contexts, I think, have the ability for you to stop and monitor what are your habits in that particular context, what are you conscious of and what are you unconscious of. If you're like, oh, I don't have any, then that probably means you're really unconscious of those behaviors. If you're like, oh, here's 37 of them, you might be conscious of 37 of them. And then what about all the other ones that you're not conscious of? If we think about, there's a term called shifting that some of you may be familiar with, of like how you have to shift your language, your tone, your dress, your posture based on particular scenarios. And I just imagine you walk into your dentist office. Nobody is at the front desk and there is a child, an 8-year-old child in the waiting room by themselves. Do you do anything to shift how you show up if you're going to engage that 8-year-old and a child or in a conversation? Chances are, yes, you do some kind of shifting. If for me, I don't spend a lot of time with children, you're welcome. So then what immediately happens to me is like, oh, small human. Wait a minute, soft spots. That's what I remember. They're probably older than that. Okay, next up, teeth. They have teeth. Okay, good to know. Don't cuss. Okay, no, like those are like the kind of stimulation that I have to go through before I can say like, hey, been to the dentist before, right? Because it's an unfamiliar conversation for me. That's me being more conscious of kind of the habitual things that I would show up with. Now, if an adult is in the dentist lobby, I probably don't need to immediately wonder how strong their cranium is, but like that is the first thing I think of when I see a child, is that they have something called a soft spot that I have learned about by holding infant people. Does this make sense? It's ludicrous that I would think about that for an 8-year-old, but I also am responsible that is literally the first thing I would think of. So whether we're talking about folks of color or homeless people or people across different classes or gay people or people who aren't your particular religion or political identification, what do you immediately think of when you think of these differences? And can you become conscious of those things? And then when you're conscious of them, you can keep them to feel safe and prepared, but now you're aware of these biases. Or do you want to edit them because you don't necessarily think they're accurate? And that editing is usually referred to as kind of unlearning these unconscious habits. I'm trying really hard to scan through these things, and it's 10:12. I'm so sorry. Job applications, I think people are pretty aware of why they don't offer certain applicants an interview. I have heard that unconscious bias is to blame for that. So, and I actually just did this activity last month where I had 4 resumes. I photocopied 4 resumes 4 different times, so I had 16 in the pile. Are you following me? And of the additional copies of the 4, I just changed their names. So I changed their names to white sounding names. I changed their names to not white sounding names. I changed their names. One of them is actually just a series of like keyboard strokes. I don't even know. It's not a name. It's just something that you wouldn't be able to pronounce. And it's fascinating as I divided a search committee. Right now there's a hiring freeze at the local university. So I was doing a workshop with the one search that did get approved. So I gave them the 16 resumes, divided the search committee into 3 different groups, gave 3 groups the 16 resumes that don't tell anyone are 4 resumes, just photocopied. And all three groups came up with exactly the same number one candidate. And of that, it was the same name, but different resumes. But it was the white man name. Like, and they came up with completely different reasons, right? So I live in a rural area, so anybody who was from a city that wasn't that guy, it was John Smith is the one that got chosen. And they were all excited. They all picked John Smith, but they didn't even realize it was three different resumes. But John Smith from the Bay Area, it loves nature. But everybody else who is from the Bay Area isn't going to be able to handle the rural area because of fit. So that bias, that is not like a 1900s kind of experiment. That is a 2020 reality that we write these stories that we are unconscious of. Those stories are informed by our habits that we are unconscious of. Now we're talking about unconscious bias. Okay, I think I was able to keep up with some of these during the actual talk. If I missed something else, please feel free to text me. That also does really inform kind of where I'm going next. And I'll get the video to you and stuff right now. Any other thoughts or comments? Thanks for staying 15 minutes late.
Thank you.
More than welcome.
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Jess. This was interesting.
See you in a couple weeks.
Bye, folks.
All right.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
June 29th.
Bye, Randy.
It's Monday. Right?
Bye. Talk to you soon.
Bye. You were first to go, first to live.
Yeah.